The morning fog hung thick over downtown Seattle as 24-year-old Emma Rodriguez made her way up the granite steps of the King County Courthouse. Her white cane tapped rhythmically against the stone, a sound she'd grown comfortable with over the years since losing her sight in a car accident at 16. Today was different, though. Today she wasn't here as a law student observer or intern. Today, she was here to witness justice being served for her younger brother Miguel. The courthouse buzzed with the usual morning energy, lawyers shuffling papers, defendants nervously waiting on wooden benches, and the echo of heels against marble floors. Emma had memorized these sounds, these rhythms of the legal system she'd grown to love despite, or perhaps because of, how it had failed her family before. "Emma, over here," called her brother's voice from across the lobby. Miguel, 19 and still bearing the emotional scars of the hit and run that had changed both their lives, approached with their mother, Maria Rodriguez. "Mija, you sure you want to be here for this?" Maria asked in accented English, her worry evident in her voice. "This Judge Harrison, the lawyer says he can be difficult." Emma straightened her shoulders, adjusting the strap of her leather briefcase, a gift from her law professor at University of Washington. "Mom, I need to be here. Miguel deserves to see justice done, and I want to witness it myself." The case was straightforward. Miguel had been crossing the street legally when a drunk driver ran a red light, hitting him and fleeing the scene. Security cameras had captured everything, and the driver, a wealthy businessman named Richard Caldwell, had been caught within hours. Today was sentencing day. As they entered courtroom 4B, Emma felt the familiar chill of institutional air conditioning and heard the rustle of people settling into wooden pews. Judge William Harrison, a man in his early 60s with a reputation for harsh sentences and little patience, presided over the oak-paneled courtroom like a king on his throne. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Harrison," announced the bailiff. The proceedings began routinely. Emma listened intently as the prosecutor presented the case's facts, her mind automatically cataloging the legal arguments and precedents that applied. This was what she lived for, the intricate dance of law and justice, the careful weighing of evidence and precedent. Then Judge Harrison spoke, and Emma's blood ran cold. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge addressed the defendant, "while your actions were certainly reckless, I understand that sometimes good people make poor choices. You've shown remorse, you're a productive member of society, and frankly, the victim seems to have recovered adequately." Emma felt Miguel tense beside her. "Adequately?" her brother whispered. "I still have nightmares. I still can't drive." Judge Harrison continued, "I'm sentencing you to 18 months probation and community service. Court costs and restitution will be determined separately." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Emma heard her mother's sharp intake of breath, felt Miguel's shoulder shaking with suppressed anger. This wasn't justice. This was a slap on the wrist for a man who could afford the best lawyers. "Your Honor," Emma heard herself saying as she stood up, her voice cutting through the courtroom chatter. "Excuse me." Judge Harrison's voice dripped with irritation. "Who is speaking?" "Emma Rodriguez, Your Honor. I'm Miguel Rodriguez's sister, and I'm also a law student. I'd like to respectfully address the court regarding this sentence." An uncomfortable silence fell over the courtroom. Emma could feel dozens of eyes on her, but she stood firm, her hand resting on her cane. "Young lady," Judge Harrison's voice took on a condescending tone, "this is not a classroom debate. You have no standing to address this court, and frankly, I don't think someone who can't even see what's happening in my courtroom is qualified to comment on legal proceedings." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Emma felt the blood drain from her face, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, with respect, my visual impairment doesn't affect my understanding of the law or my ability to recognize when justice isn't being served." "Security," Judge Harrison called, his voice rising, "please escort this person from my courtroom. And in the future, perhaps family members should focus on matters they can actually handle instead of playing lawyer." The humiliation burned through Emma like fire. She heard the heavy footsteps of the bailiff approaching, felt her mother's hand on her arm, heard Miguel's whispered curse. But what hurt most was the laughter. Cruel, uncomfortable laughter from some people in the courtroom who seemed to find Judge Harrison's cruelty amusing. "Emma, come on," Miguel whispered urgently. "Let's just go." As Emma was escorted from the courtroom, her cane clicking against the floor with each deliberate step, she made a silent promise. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Outside the courthouse, the Seattle drizzle had begun, matching Emma's mood perfectly. Her mother and Miguel flanked her on either side, their anger palpable in the humid air. "That judge is a monster," Miguel spat. "The way he talked to you." 18 months probation, Maria said, her voice hollow with disappointment. "For nearly killing my son." Emma said nothing for a long moment, listening to the sounds of the city around them. Car horns, distant construction, the hum of life continuing despite the injustice they'd just witnessed. Finally, she spoke. "Miguel, do you remember what I told you when I decided to go to law school? That you wanted to make sure what happened to us never happened to anyone else." "Exactly. And Judge Harrison just gave me more motivation than any professor ever could." As they walked toward the bus stop, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message. She pulled it out and activated the voice reader. "Emma, this is Professor Williams from UW Law. Could you call me when you get a chance? I have some exciting news about your Supreme Court application." Emma's heart skipped a beat. 3 months ago, she'd applied for one of the most prestigious positions a law student could dream of, a clerkship with the United States Supreme Court. The odds were astronomical. They only selected a handful of clerks each year from thousands of applicants nationwide. "What is it, Mija?" her mother asked, noticing Emma had stopped walking. "I need to make a phone call," Emma said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "A very important phone call." 2 weeks later, Emma stood in the marble halls of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C., her heart pounding with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The orientation for new clerks was comprehensive: security protocols, building layout, introduction to the justices and their chambers. Everything felt surreal, like she was walking through a dream she'd had since childhood. "Miss Rodriguez," came a warm voice from behind her. Emma turned to find Justice Margaret Chen approaching, her footsteps confident on the marble floor. "I wanted to personally welcome you to the court. Your writing sample on civil rights law was exceptional." "Thank you, Justice Chen. It's an honor to be here. I understand you're from Seattle?" "Yes, ma'am. Born and raised." Emma didn't mention the recent humiliation in Judge Harrison's courtroom. This was her fresh start, her chance to work at the highest level of American jurisprudence. The first week flew by in a blur of research, memo writing, and late nights in the court's library. Emma had always been a quick study, but the intensity here was unlike anything she'd experienced. Her fellow clerks, brilliant graduates from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, initially seemed skeptical of her abilities, but her meticulous research and insightful analysis quickly earned their respect. "Emma, how do you do it?" asked James, a Harvard law graduate, as they worked late one evening on a complex constitutional law case. "Your research briefs are incredibly thorough. You catch details the rest of us miss." Emma smiled, not looking up from her Braille display connected to her laptop. When you can't rely on visual scanning, you learn to listen more carefully, to think more systematically. Every word matters. It was during her 3rd week that the case arrived, one that would change everything. "Rodriguez," called Chief Justice Roberts from his chamber door. "Could you come in here, please?" Emma gathered her materials and made her way to the Chief Justice's office, a room she'd only been in twice before. The smell of leather-bound books and coffee filled the air. "Emma, I'm assigning you to research a case that's just been appealed to us. It involves judicial misconduct and civil rights violations. The appellant claims a federal judge in Washington state violated her civil rights by removing her from a courtroom based on her disability." Emma's blood turned to ice. What's the case name, sir?" "Rodriguez versus Harrison and the State of Washington. The appellant is claiming the judge violated the Americans with Disabilities Act and her constitutional rights. Interesting coincidence with the name, isn't it?" Emma's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the case file. "Yes, sir. Very interesting. The case has gained some media attention. Apparently, there's video footage of the incident. The appellant is a law student who was publicly humiliated by the judge. She's representing herself, which is unusual for a Supreme Court case, but her brief is remarkably well crafted." That evening, Emma sat in her small D.C. apartment, the case file spread before her in Braille and digital formats. She'd filed the appeal herself, with help from Professor Williams and a civil rights organization, but she never imagined it would make it this far, this fast. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was now in the position of researching her own case for the Supreme Court. The ethical implications made her head spin. She would have to recuse herself, of course, but not before she fully understood how her case had traveled through the system. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Hello, Emma, it's Professor Williams. I just saw the news. Your case made it to the Supreme Court docket. How are you handling this?" I'm actually clerking on it, Professor. I haven't told anyone yet." A long pause. "Emma, you know you'll have to disclose this immediately, right? The ethical implications." "I know. I'm going to speak with Chief Justice Roberts first thing tomorrow morning." "Good. But Emma, this is huge. Win or lose, you've already accomplished something extraordinary. A law student getting a case to the Supreme Court. It's almost unheard of." After hanging up, Emma walked to her window overlooking the Capitol building. The city lights twinkled in the distance, and she thought about that horrible day in Judge Harrison's courtroom. How many other people had he humiliated? How many others had been denied basic dignity because of his prejudices? Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Judge Harrison was having problems of his own. The video of Emma's ejection from his courtroom, recorded by a court reporter's backup system, had been leaked to local news stations. The footage showed his cruel comments and dismissive attitude in stark detail. "Judge Harrison," read the news anchor on King 5 News, "the King County Bar Association has announced they're launching an investigation into your conduct. The woman you removed from your courtroom, Emma Rodriguez, has filed a federal civil rights lawsuit that's now being heard by the Supreme Court." Judge Harrison, watching from his downtown Seattle condo, nearly choked on his whiskey. "Supreme Court," he muttered to his empty living room. "That's impossible." But the evidence was mounting. Legal blogs were dissecting his behavior, civil rights organizations were calling for his removal from the bench, and his past cases were being scrutinized for similar incidents. The comfortable world he'd built on intimidation and prejudice was crumbling around him. The next morning, Emma sat across from Chief Justice Roberts in his chamber, her heart pounding as she explained the situation. "So you're telling me," the Chief Justice said slowly, "that Emma Rodriguez, the appellant in Rodriguez versus Harrison, is you?" "Yes, sir. I should have disclosed this immediately when the case was assigned to me. I apologize for the delay." Chief Justice Roberts leaned back in his chair, studying Emma's face. "Miss Rodriguez, in my 30 years on federal courts, I've never encountered a situation quite like this. A Supreme Court clerk researching her own case against a federal judge. I understand if you need to terminate my position, sir. This is highly irregular." "Terminate your position?" Chief Justice Roberts laughed, a sound Emma hadn't expected. "Miss Rodriguez, you've just demonstrated exactly the kind of legal mind we need on this court. You recognized the ethical issue and brought it to my attention immediately. That shows integrity. What happens now?" "Now, Justice Chen will take over your case. You'll be recused from all research and discussions related to it." "But Emma..." He paused, his voice becoming more serious. "I want you to know that what happened to you in that courtroom was wrong. Federal judges are held to the highest standards, and Judge Harrison fell far short of those standards." The day of oral arguments for Rodriguez versus Harrison arrived on a crisp October morning in Washington, D.C. Emma sat in the courtroom's public gallery, no longer the naive law student who'd been humiliated in Seattle, but a Supreme Court clerk who'd earned the respect of the highest court in the land. The courtroom was packed. Media attention had turned the case into a national conversation about disability rights, judicial conduct, and equal access to justice. Emma could hear the whispered conversations around her, the shuffle of papers, the nervous energy that always preceded a major Supreme Court hearing. "Oh yes, oh yes, oh yes," called the court crier. "The Honorable, the Chief Justice and the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States. All persons having business before the Honorable, the Supreme Court of the United States, are admonished to draw near and give their attention, for the court is now sitting. God save the United States and this honorable court." Emma stood with everyone else, her heart racing. This was it, the culmination of months of legal battles, personal growth, and professional development. Her attorney, Sarah Chen, no relation to Justice Chen, approached the podium. Emma had initially wanted to argue her own case, but the civil rights organization supporting her had insisted on experienced Supreme Court counsel. Chief Justice Roberts and Associate Justices, Sarah began, this case is fundamentally about whether all Americans, regardless of their physical abilities, have equal access to our courts and equal dignity under the law. The questioning from the justices was intense but fair. Justice Thomas asked about the scope of ADA accommodations in courtrooms. Justice Kagan pressed on the standards for judicial misconduct. Justice Barrett inquired about the balance between judicial authority and civil rights. Then came the defense's turn. Judge Harrison's attorney, a nervous-looking man in an expensive suit, argued that judges needed discretion to maintain order in their courtrooms. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Chief Justice Roberts, Judge Harrison was simply trying to maintain the dignity and order of his courtroom. He had no way of knowing that Miss Rodriguez was a law student. Justice Sotomayor, the court's first Latina justice and someone who'd faced her own share of discrimination, leaned forward. "Counselor, are you suggesting that Judge Harrison's comments would have been appropriate if Miss Rodriguez had been any other citizen? Does someone need special credentials to deserve basic human dignity in a courtroom?" The attorney stumbled through his response, clearly unprepared for the justice's pointed question. Justice Gorsuch followed up, "The record shows that Judge Harrison made specific comments about Miss Rodriguez's blindness, suggesting she couldn't understand legal proceedings because of her disability. How is that maintaining courtroom order rather than expressing personal prejudice?" Emma listened with professional admiration as the justices dissected the case. This was legal reasoning at its highest level, and she was witnessing it as both a participant and a student of the law. After oral arguments, Emma met with her legal team and supporters outside the courthouse. Miguel had flown in from Seattle, along with Professor Williams and several classmates from UW Law. "How do you think it went?" Miguel asked, still amazed that his sister's case had made it this far. "The justices asked good questions," Emma replied diplomatically. "Now we wait." But they didn't have to wait long. In an unusual move, the court announced it would issue its decision within 2 weeks rather than the typical months-long deliberation period. Legal experts speculated that the case's clear-cut nature and the compelling video evidence had made the decision straightforward. Meanwhile, back in Seattle, Judge Harrison's world continued to collapse. The State Judicial Conduct Commission had opened a formal investigation, and several of his past cases were being reviewed for similar misconduct. Local newspapers were running exposés on his pattern of behavior toward minorities, women, and people with disabilities. "Bill," his wife Carol said over breakfast one morning, "maybe it's time to consider retirement. This stress isn't good for your health." Judge Harrison stared at his coffee, aged years in just months. 30 years on the bench, Carol. 30 years, and it's all going to be remembered for one moment with one girl. One moment of cruelty, Bill. Maybe it's time to think about what kind of legacy you really want to leave. The Supreme Court's decision came down on a Tuesday morning in November. Emma was in Justice Chen's chambers, working on an unrelated case, when her phone buzzed with news alerts. Breaking, Supreme Court rules 9-0 in Rodriguez v. Harrison, finds judge violated civil rights. Emma's hands shook as she read the decision summary. A unanimous ruling. All 9 justices had agreed that Judge Harrison's conduct violated her civil rights under both the ADA and the 14th Amendment. Chief Justice Roberts, writing for the court, had crafted a decision that would reshape how federal courts handle disability accommodations. The courthouse is the temple of justice, and all Americans must be welcomed there with equal dignity and respect. A federal judge who mocks, demeans, or excludes citizens based on their disabilities violates the most fundamental principles of our legal system. The decision went further, establishing new guidelines for judicial conduct and requiring federal courts to implement enhanced disability awareness training for all judges and court personnel. Justice Sotomayor had written a concurring opinion that brought tears to Emma's eyes. Miss Rodriguez's courage in pursuing this case, despite facing a system that initially failed her, exemplifies the best of American legal tradition. Her journey from a humiliated courtroom observer to a Supreme Court clerk demonstrates that justice, while sometimes delayed, will not be denied to those brave enough to pursue it. Within hours, Emma's phone was ringing constantly. News organizations wanted interviews, legal journals requested articles, and law schools were calling with speaking invitations. That evening, Emma sat in her apartment with Miguel, who'd flown in immediately after the decision was announced. They were sharing Chinese takeout and reflecting on the journey that had brought them here. "Emma," Miguel said quietly, "I need to tell you something." That day in the courthouse, when Judge Harrison humiliated you. I was so angry I wanted to give up on the whole system. I thought justice was just for rich people like Caldwell. What changed your mind? Watching you. Watching you turn that humiliation into motivation, seeing you refuse to let one cruel judge destroy your faith in the law. You showed me that the system isn't broken. Sometimes it just needs people brave enough to fix it. Emma smiled, thinking about her journey from that horrible day in Seattle to this moment of vindication. You know what the best part is, Miguel? This decision will help other people who face discrimination. Judge Harrison might have done us a favor by showing his true colors so publicly. Her phone rang, Professor Williams calling from Seattle. Emma, I just saw the news. How does it feel to have won a unanimous Supreme Court decision? It feels like justice, Professor. Finally. There's something else, Emma. Judge Harrison announced his retirement this afternoon, effective immediately. The Judicial Conduct Commission was planning to recommend his removal, but he resigned before they could act. Emma felt a complex mix of emotions. She'd never wanted to destroy Judge Harrison's career, just to ensure he couldn't treat others the way he'd treated her. Professor, do you think this will really change things? Emma, you've just set a precedent that will protect disabled Americans in courtrooms across the country for generations. Yes, I think this will change everything. 3 months later, Emma received a letter that made her smile. It was from a young deaf law student in Texas who'd been denied reasonable accommodations during her bar exam. The student wrote, Miss Rodriguez, your case gave me the courage to fight for my rights. Because of your victory, I was able to take the bar exam with proper accommodations, and I passed. Thank you for showing me that we belong in the legal profession. Similar letters arrived weekly, from disabled attorneys, law students, and ordinary citizens who'd been inspired by Emma's story. Each one reminded her why she'd chosen to fight, why she'd refused to let Judge Harrison's cruelty define her future. On a warm spring evening, Emma stood once again on the steps of the Supreme Court building, but this time as someone who'd helped shape its jurisprudence. Her white cane tapped against the marble steps, the same rhythm she'd carried through law school, through humiliation, and ultimately to victory. Justice Chen had asked her to stay on for another term as a clerk, an unusual honor that spoke to her exceptional performance. But Emma had other plans. She was returning to Seattle to start her own practice, focusing on civil rights and disability law. The law is a living thing, she said to herself, repeating words from her first-year constitutional law class. It grows and adapts, and sometimes it needs people to push it toward justice. As she walked down the steps toward her new future, Emma carried with her not just the satisfaction of personal vindication, but the knowledge that her courage had made the legal system more just for everyone. Judge Harrison's moment of cruelty had inadvertently created a champion for justice, and that, perhaps, was the most fitting outcome of all. Back in Seattle, a new judge sat in courtroom 4B, a young Latina woman who kept a copy of Rodriguez versus Harrison on her desk. Every day, she remembered that justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but the wisdom to treat every person who enters her courtroom with dignity and respect. The scales of justice, as Emma had learned, don't always balance quickly. But when they do, the weight of that balance can reshape the world.